The night my husband fell asleep on my shoulder, the two armed men in the front of our car forgot how to breathe. I watched it happen in the rearview mirror. The young driver went rigid behind the wheel, eyes wide and fixed. And Tomas, who had protected Lucien Carbone for 22 years, reached up and slowly tilted that mirror downward until my sleeping husband disappeared from view, as if he were hiding something priceless from a thief. Nobody spoke for almost an hour. In 19 years, no employee had ever watched Lucien sleep, and the reason was buried so deep that digging it up would nearly cost the most loyal man he had everything. My name is June Avery. I am 34, and I repair sound systems in hotels for a living. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, in the back of my father's radio repair shop, learning which hum meant a dying tube and which crackle meant a loose wire. He has been gone 6 years, and I still carry his battered tool case to every job. Nothing about that life suggested I would end up married to one of the most feared men in the city. But 8 months ago, that is exactly what happened, and half my family is still waiting for the punchline. The morning it all began, I was lying on my back under a sound console in a hotel ballroom, chasing a hum that had survived 3 other technicians, when my phone buzzed against my collarbone. My sister Teresa's name lit the screen. She called to remind me about Sunday dinner and to ask, in that bright, older sister voice, whether I was still living like everything in my life was temporary: the job, the apartment, the marriage. I told her the hum was almost fixed and hung up before she could hear what her question did to me. That is the thing about family. They hand you a ruler before you can walk, then spend the rest of your life measuring you with it. I had spent years pretending the measurements did not sting. Maybe June Avery really was the woman people enjoyed for a season and never built a life around. I fixed the ballroom hum in 40 minutes. The other hum took longer. I met Lucien because his organization used a downtown hotel for meetings, and I was the technician they called when the conference room speakers hissed. Everyone else in that building walked around him like he was a loaded weapon. I walked around him like he was a scheduling inconvenience. The first time we spoke, I told him his people kept unplugging the wrong cable, and he looked at me the way a man looks at weather he cannot order to stop. We argued for 10 minutes about a mixing board. Somehow, that became coffee. For months, coffee became late dinners in empty hotel kitchens, and late dinners became a quiet wedding neither of us dressed up with the word love. We told anyone who asked that it was practical. He needed someone unimpressed by him. I needed someone who did not think fixing speakers was a hobby I would outgrow. The truth was stranger. I married him because he remembered that my father used to burn toast every Sunday, and because silence next to him never felt empty. Our marriage ran on small rituals no one would call romantic. Every armored car in his convoy carried peppermint candies in the door pocket, because he noticed once, months before we married, that motion sickness turned me gray on long drives. He mocked the old radio comedies I played from my phone, called them museum noise, and then quoted a character's line back to me 2 days later without missing a beat. He never once suggested I quit my job. In his world, that restraint was practically a love letter. My sisters did not see it that way. Teresa, the oldest, has the suburban house, the steady husband, and the firm belief that adulthood comes with a mortgage. Monica, 3 years younger than her and 3 years older than me, joins every joke Teresa starts. At Sunday dinners, they called my marriage my temporary life, as if I were house-sitting someone else's future. I always laughed first, because laughing first meant the joke could not land where it hurt. I had been doing that for years without noticing the cost. As for Lucien, the public man and the private man might as well have been strangers. In public, he spoke quietly, gave instructions once, and never, ever showed fatigue. His men swore he did not sleep, and I slowly understood they meant it literally. In 8 months of marriage, through late drives and longer nights, I had never seen him close his eyes when a single employee was near. He would rest his head back, breathe evenly, fake it beautifully, but sleep. Real sleep was something he treated like an unlocked door. The trouble started small. A competitor secured a hotel services contract in Rosemont roughly an hour before Lucian's representative arrived to negotiate for it. Annoying, but coincidences happen. Then a shipping arrangement on the west side collapsed because someone had quietly offered better terms the day before Lucian's people made their approach. 2 incidents in 4 weeks. Lucian said nothing publicly, but I noticed him rereading his own schedule at night, like a man checking the locks on doors he had already locked twice. Then came the third one, a private meeting with a trucking contractor, arranged quietly, known to maybe 6 people, all of them veterans. The competitor's man was sitting in the hotel lounge when Lucian walked in, smiling like a host. The room that evening was full of men who had served Lucian for decades, and I watched him scan their faces while he shook the competitor's hand, and I understood that suspicion, once it enters a house, does not knock before entering every room in it. Nothing confidential had appeared in public, no records leaked, no names printed, nothing a lawyer could point at. Whoever it was worked softly, arriving first at negotiations, undercutting bids, applying pressure without ever attacking Lucian directly. Lucian began narrowing access. Fewer people saw his calendar, fewer cars knew his routes, and the man who had always been controlled became something colder, because betrayal from a distance is a puzzle, but betrayal from inside is a wound. That was when I first noticed Tomas in the mirror. Tomas Bellini was 56, silver-haired, old school, the kind of man who opened doors without being asked and never once asked for credit. Before nearly every trip, while settling into the driver's seat or checking the cabin, he would reach up and lower the rearview mirror a few degrees. The first time, I joked that he was checking whether Lucian was behaving in the back. Tomas did not laugh. He just adjusted the glass, checked the mirrors that mattered, and drove. The behavior repeated on later trips, always the same small motion, always before we left the garage. Meanwhile, Malcolm Voss, Lucian's security chief, began doing what security chiefs do. Malcolm was 47, 9 years with the organization, efficient and calm, and fond of saying that modern systems should replace sentimental loyalty. In a meeting I was not supposed to overhear, he pointed out that Tomas had more unsupervised access to the vehicles than almost anyone on the payroll. In the weeks that followed, Tomas began lingering near the vehicles during maintenance, asking the garage supervisor who had signed for what. At the time I read it as a guilty man checking his work. That is the cruelty of suspicion. It translates everything into the language you already fear. Lucian did not accuse Tomas of anything, but I watched the possibility land behind his eyes like a stone sinking into deep water, and I watched him start counting things. Who rode in which car? Who stood where during which conversation? He had built his whole authority on preparation and memory, and now memory had become a weapon pointed at his own people. In those weeks, he barely slept at all, and by the time Milwaukee came around, he had been awake for the better part of 40 hours. In the middle of that tension came another Avery family dinner, which my sisters treated as a scheduled intervention. Teresa leaned over her pot roast and asked, sweetly, why I still crawled under hotel sound consoles when my husband could simply buy me a business. Monica chimed in that a woman with a rich husband and a toolbox was either stubborn or confused. My mother said nothing, which was its own opinion. I smiled, passed the potatoes, and said I liked my work. Teresa patted my hand like I had said something brave and doomed. What I could not explain to them was that the toolbox was the point. My father taught me that a broken thing deserves a proper diagnosis before anyone declares it dead, and that lesson became my whole life. Work was the ground I stood on. Give it up, and I would be nothing but a wife, decorating a dangerous man's hallway. That night, driving home, I told Lucian about dinner, expecting him to finally make the offer my sisters kept predicting. Instead, he said quietly that he had never offered to buy me a business because he knew I wanted my work to stay mine. I sat with that for a long moment. No man I had ever dated understood that distinction, and the most feared man in Chicago had understood it without being told. If you have ever had someone love the part of you that everyone else wanted to fix, tap that like button and subscribe, because this story is about exactly that kind of love, the quiet kind, and what happened next proved it runs deeper than I ever imagined. The Milwaukee trip was supposed to last a morning. It lasted 14 hours. Lucian sat across a table from men who smiled too much, renegotiating terms that the leaks had already weakened, and by the time we loaded into the armored car for the drive back to Chicago, midnight had come and gone. He had slept maybe 3 hours in the last 40. I watched him loosen his tie with fingers that moved a half-second slow, and I did something I knew would start an argument. I turned on one of my father's favorite radio comedies. He called it insufferable. I called it a classic. He said the jokes were older than the interstate we were driving on, and I said at least the jokes had aged honestly, which made the young driver up front cough to hide a laugh. Then, mid-complaint, Lucian correctly named the episode's recurring character, the nosy landlord, and predicted his entrance 2 lines before it happened. I raised an eyebrow. He looked out the window like the city lights required urgent supervision, and muttered that he had heard it once, against his will. Our argument got quieter after that, the way arguments do when both people have already won. The tires hummed, the radio voices bickered gently. Somewhere around Kenosha, I asked him a question about the morning schedule, and he did not answer. I assumed he was ignoring me, which was his usual surrender. Then I felt the weight. His head had settled, by slow degrees, against my shoulder, and his breathing had gone deep and even and utterly defenseless. Lucian Carbone, the man who treated sleep like a security breach, was asleep. On me. I waited for him to jolt awake and pull back. That is what always happened when he drifted too close to real rest. 10 seconds passed, then 30. He did not move. His hand, which always held a phone or a folder or a pen, lay open and empty on the seat between us, and the lines between his eyebrows, the ones that never fully relaxed, had smoothed out like water settling. I became aware that I was barely breathing, as if my own lungs might wake him. Then I glanced toward the front of the car. The young driver was staring into the mirror, wide-eyed, like a man watching a statue walk. He was not amused. He was not charmed. He looked like he had seen a ghost, like the natural order of his whole working life had just been quietly repealed in the back seat. And Tomas reached up and tilted the mirror down, far down, until Lucian was gone from it. For almost an hour I did not move. My arm went numb, then my shoulder, then the whole left side of me, and I did not care, because waking him felt cruel in a way I could not have explained to anyone. The man had carried half the city on 40 hours of no sleep. If the price of 1 hour of rest was my numb arm, I would pay it twice. Outside, the dark interstate unspooled. Inside, the loudest man I knew by reputation made no sound at all. When he finally woke, he did not startle. He simply became still in a different way, awake behind closed eyes for 1 breath, then 2, deciding something. Then he sat up, straightened his cuffs, and asked, in a voice with no embarrassment in it at all, how long he had been asleep. I told him. He nodded once, like a man filing a number away, and went silent. I asked him why his guards had looked so frightened. He looked at the front seats and said nothing at all. That nothing told me more than an answer would have. Lucian never wasted words, but he also never hoarded them from me. Not anymore. This was the first door he had ever closed between us, and I realized, watching the muscle work in his jaw, that the rule about sleep was not discipline. It was not control, or image, or any of the things his enemies probably assumed. It came from somewhere specific, somewhere with edges. And whatever it had just happened again, on my shoulder, in front of witnesses. 2 days later, I got my first clue, and it arrived, of all places, through a car radio. We were pulling out of Lucian's private garage, the underground one beneath his offices, when I heard it, under the music. A faint, rhythmic interference, a soft, pulsing tick, layered under the broadcast. I was raised on a workbench. My father used to say that random static is weather, but pattern static is intent. This pattern repeated, clean and regular, for about 6 blocks. Then it vanished completely. I tested it the way he taught me. On the next 3 departures, I sat with my phone's radio app running and my attention wide open, and every single time, the interference began as we left the garage and died a few blocks later. Same rhythm, same duration. Never at any other point in the trip. Never when we parked anywhere else in the city. Whatever was talking, it was talking to something inside that garage. Randomness does not keep a schedule. Machines do. I did not tell Lucian yet. I had learned in 8 months of marriage that information handed to Lucian became action, and action in his world had a way of becoming permanent before anyone double-checked it. So on a quiet Tuesday, while the convoy sat idle and Lucian was in meetings upstairs, I asked the garage supervisor for 40 minutes with the lead car to chase a sound issue. I told him the radio reception had been poor. I started where the interference lived. Radio signal follows rules, and my father drilled them into me before I could drive. You work from the antenna inward, you isolate, you listen. The interference strongest near the cabin center, faint at the doors, faint at the trunk. I pressed my ear near the headliner, the dashboard, the seats. Then I leaned forward between the front seats, and the pulsing tick sharpened like a radio station finally coming into tune. It was coming from the rearview mirror housing. My hands were steadier than my heart. I did not touch anything, because 8 months in Lucian's world had taught me that untouched evidence is the only kind that talks honestly. Instead, I made one phone call to an old colleague of my father's who swept corporate offices for a living and owed the Avery family 2 decades of favors. He came that evening with a case of instruments and left 3 hours later with his hat in his hands. Inside the mirror housing, he had found a miniature microphone, a pinhole camera, and a short-range transmitter built to handshake with a relay somewhere in the garage. And here is the detail that turned my stomach. The camera moved with the mirror. It had been mounted so that wherever the mirror pointed, the lens looked, which meant every time Tomas reached up and adjusted that mirror before a trip, he was repositioning a hidden camera. Every trip I had noted, every small, silent tilt of the glass, was suddenly written in a new and ugly language. The leaks, the access, the mirror, the maintenance visits. In my mind, the case built itself, and it spelled Tomas. Lucian received the news the way deep water receives a stone. No ripple on the surface, and everything moving underneath. He listened to the sweep report in his office without interrupting once, then asked Malcolm to pull the maintenance records, and Malcolm pulled them with the smooth regret of a man delivering bad news he has been carrying respectfully for weeks. Tomas had signed for mirror service. Tomas had unsupervised vehicle hours before nearly every trip. Tomas, who had been trusted for 22 years. I watched something close over my husband's face that night, and it frightened me more than his temper ever could have. Temper is weather. This was climate. He did not shout. He did not break anything. He simply began, in his quiet voice, arranging the removal of a man who had guarded his life since before I finished grade school, and every record Malcolm laid on the desk made the arrangement easier. The word removal in that room did not mean unemployment, and everyone present understood that. Here is where I have to stop and ask you something, because I have wondered about it ever since. If every piece of evidence in front of you pointed at a man who had been loyal for 2 decades, and your own husband's safety was the price of being wrong, would you speak up on instinct alone, or would you let the evidence finish its sentence? Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because what I did next either saved an innocent man or nearly destroyed us, and I still do not know which was closer to the truth. What stopped me was not sentiment. It was my father's voice, the one that lived in my hands after all those years at his workbench. A broken thing deserves a proper diagnosis before anyone declares it dead, and something in this diagnosis did not sit right. I lay awake most of that night replaying the trips, the way you replay a recording that has one note out of tune, and somewhere near dawn, the wrong note finally sounded. Every time Tomas touched that mirror, he had tilted it down, away, not toward Lucian, away from him. Think about what that meant. If Tomas had installed that camera to spy on his boss, then why, trip after trip, had he aimed its only eye at the floor of the car? Why would a traitor blind his own device? I sat up in the dark with my heart going hard, because the whole beautiful case Malcolm had laid out had a crack straight down the middle of it, and the crack had a shape, and the shape was a mirror pointing at nothing. I found Lucian in his office before sunrise, standing at the window with the maintenance records still on his desk like an open grave. I did not ask permission. I told him he was about to remove the wrong man, and I told him why. He listened the way he always listened, absolutely still, and when I finished, he said that one inconsistent detail does not acquit a man. I said no, it does not. But in my trade, one inconsistent detail means you keep the device on the bench and take it apart again, because the first theory was wrong. He gave me 1 day. In his world, that was an enormous act of faith, and both of us knew it. We brought Tomas in that afternoon, to the same office, with the same records on the desk, and I will remember until I die how the old man stood. Not defiant, not pleading, just tired, like a soldier who has been expecting the wrong bullet for weeks. Lucian laid the sweep report in front of him and said one word. Explain. Tomas looked at the report for a long moment, and then he did the last thing I expected. He looked relieved. He said he had found the camera's lens reflection 11 weeks earlier, purely by chance, catching the light at an angle no camera should have made. He had traced the mirror replacement through the service chain and found the work order carried a legitimate security authorization, Malcolm's authorization. And that, Tomas said quietly, was the moment he realized he could not tell anyone at all, because Malcolm controlled counter-surveillance. If the device was sanctioned equipment, reporting it meant confessing he had been snooping through security installations. If it was compromised, reporting it to the man who signed for it was worse. And if Malcolm himself was the hand behind it, then Tomas, standing alone in an office making accusations, would simply make Tomas the first body the story consumed. So he chose the only protection no one could trace. Every trip, he aimed the camera at the floor, and every night he checked the pattern, waiting for proof. He had carried that alone for 11 weeks, knowing it looked like guilt. Lucian asked him, in a voice I had never heard from him before, why he had not simply come to him. And Tomas said the thing that explained the whole story. He said, "There is history here you would not want reopened, boss, and I was not going to be the man who reopened it before I was sure." Lucian went very still. I watched my husband's face and understood that Tomas was no longer talking about cameras. Then Tomas told me, because I asked, why he had moved so fast that night on the interstate, the night Lucian slept on my shoulder. 19 years earlier, he said, Lucian's mother was dying in a hospital on the north side, and Lucian, barely 31 and new to real power, sat vigil outside her room for days without sleeping. On the last night, in a parked car in the hospital lot, exhaustion finally put him under. A driver the family trusted photographed him there. The picture was sold, and it circulated through rival circles for months as proof that grief had made the young Carbone soft. The men who bought that photograph were not buying an image. They were buying permission, the permission to believe the new boss could be hurt. Tomas said he had watched what it cost Lucian to stand back up under that, watched him learn that a single unguarded minute could be turned into currency and spent against him for years. From that day forward, no employee ever saw Lucian Carbone asleep again. Not once. Not until a tired man on an interstate let his head fall onto the shoulder of a woman who fixed radios, and the men up front saw their whole understanding of the world go quietly to pieces. That was why they had stared like they had seen a ghost. They had. The ghost was a version of Lucian that had died in a hospital parking lot 19 years ago, and there it was, breathing evenly against my shoulder in the back seat. Tomas had not tilted that mirror to hide evidence of his own crime. He had tilted it because he knew exactly what that sleeping face would be worth to the wrong eyes, and he could not stop the camera from existing, but he could make sure it recorded nothing worth selling. Even under suspicion, even alone, the man had been guarding my husband's oldest wound. The room was silent for a long time after Tomas finished. Then Lucian did something I had never seen him do in 8 months of marriage. He apologized, quietly, precisely, without decoration, to the man he had spent 2 weeks preparing to remove. Tomas accepted it with a single nod, and just like that I understood what 22 years of loyalty actually looked like. It looked like a man who did not need the apology to have already forgiven the debt. The old loyalty Malcolm kept calling sentimental turned out to be the only thing in that building that had never once been for sale. But the problem was not solved. We had a device, a relay, and a signature on a work order, and none of it proved who was listening, because Malcolm's whole genius was that everything he did looked like his job. Destroy the transmitter, and the real traitor would simply go quiet and wait. Accuse Malcolm without proof, and the security chief would wrap himself in procedure and emerge cleaner than before. It was Lucian who asked what I would do if this were a faulty system I could not afford to shut down. And that is when my father's second lesson came back to me. You do not test a wire by cutting it. You test it by sending a signal down it and watching where the light comes out. So we fed the wire. For 3 days we left every piece of the surveillance exactly where it was, untouched and blinking, and we rehearsed. Then, on a Thursday drive, with the camera aimed where Malcolm would expect it aimed, Lucian and I had a conversation in the back of that car about a private negotiation that did not exist. A warehouse services deal in Gary, Indiana. A specific address. A specific time. Lucian named a figure large enough to make any rival drop everything, and I argued against it just enough to make it real. Only 3 people alive knew the meeting was fiction: Lucian, Tomas, and me. If you are still here at this point in the story, that already tells me you understand something Malcolm never did. The quiet people are usually the ones holding everything together. The trap worked faster than any of us predicted. Within hours of our drive, the transmitter woke up. The garage relay passed our fiction onward, and a Carbone monitoring post, Tomas now quietly controlled, watched the signal travel through security infrastructure that answered to exactly one man's authorization. By Saturday morning, the competitor who had been haunting us for months arrived at an empty building in Gary, with lawyers, staff, and a leased convoy, ready to win a negotiation that existed nowhere but inside our car. The information had moved down a wire with one name at the end of it. Lucian confronted Malcolm on the top floor of the Carbone offices, in front of the senior guard team, and I was there because I had earned my place in that room with a workbench education Malcolm had never thought to fear. The security chief tried procedure first. The leaks were Tomas's access. The surveillance was sanctioned protocol. The Gary disaster proved nothing. Then Lucian laid the relay logs on the table, page by page, and Malcolm read his own signature out of the silence, and I watched a very calm man discover the exact moment his career ended. His last defense was the one that told me who he really was. Malcolm looked at me, then at Tomas, and told Lucian that I had made him sentimental, that this was what happened when a boss let a wife and an old soldier replace systems with feelings. Sentimental loyalty, he called it, the weakness that had let the breach happen. And Lucian, the man who had spent 19 years believing vulnerability was currency his enemies could spend, did something the old Lucian would never have done. He agreed that he had been wrong, not about trusting, about suspecting. He had nearly destroyed his most loyal man on evidence built by the actual traitor, and he said so in front of everyone. Malcolm was removed from every Carbone operation that day. No violence, no headlines, just a man walked out of a building his systems no longer recognized, stripped of access, authority, and the gatekeeping power he had spent 9 years quietly arranging. That had been the real plan all along, Tomas told me later. The rivals were never the point. Malcolm had been feeding them just enough to make Lucian believe his veterans had gone unreliable, so the old guard would be cleared out and replaced with men who owed their positions to Malcolm alone. He did not want Lucian's chair. He wanted to own the doorway to it, forever. Tomas was promoted, not merely forgiven. Lucian named him senior security commander in front of the same room that had watched him nearly condemned, and the old man accepted the title the way he accepted everything, with a nod that carried more weight than anyone else's speech. As for me, I went back to work the next morning, under a sound console, at a hotel off Michigan Avenue, and Lucian did not buy me the company, or the building, or anything else. He asked me, over coffee, whether they had finally fixed the wiring I had been complaining about for months. That was the reward. He had listened. It was enough. It was everything. The next Avery dinner, Teresa started in again, gently, the way she always did, about my temporary life, the rented apartment, the battered tool case, the husband whose world I visited but surely could not belong to. And for the first time in years, I did not laugh first. I let the silence sit until it was honest, and then I told my sisters that I had stopped measuring permanence by what a life looks like from the outside. I like the life I chose, I said. No defense, no performance. Monica looked at Teresa, and nobody reached for the ruler again. That Sunday, Lucian did something he had not done in 19 years of Sundays. He cleared his schedule with no explanation and ordered the car out. No meeting, no negotiation, no destination that required protecting. We drove along Lake Michigan with the water flashing between the buildings, and when I asked where we were going, he said nowhere, and the word sounded strange and weightless coming from a man whose every hour had been armor-plated since before we met. I turned on the radio comedy, the same episode from the Milwaukee Drive. He called it insufferable. Then he predicted the nosy landlord's entrance 2 lines early and did not even pretend to be embarrassed about it. The peppermint was waiting in the door pocket beside my seat. His folders stayed closed on the seat across from us. And somewhere north of the harbor, while the radio voices bickered and the lake ran silver beside us, my husband shifted deliberately toward me, lowered his head onto my shoulder, and closed his eyes. He was fully awake when he did it. That is the detail I will carry to my grave. The first time, exhaustion had breached his walls. This time, he opened the gate himself. In the front seat, Tomas looked once, just once, and then he reached up, not for the mirror, and quietly raised the privacy partition. No one stared. No one needed to. The thing that had once been stolen from a grieving man in a hospital parking lot had finally become something he could give. I sat very still, like the first time, but for a different reason now. Not fear of breaking a fragile accident, respect for a decision 19 years in the making. He sleeps now, sometimes, on drives with no destination, and his guards no longer look like they have seen a ghost. They look like men who finally understand what they are actually protecting. It was never the empire. It was this, a tired man who spent 2 decades surrounded by people paid to keep him alive, and one woman with a toolbox beside whom he no longer had to stay awake. If you believe the strongest thing a guarded person can do is choose to rest, tell me in the comments and subscribe for the next story. Because trust like this is rarer than fear. I know, because I married the most feared man in Chicago, and I am the place where he sleeps.